not actually be in your real life attentive to difference, to letting people be however they are. If you see what I mean?
What's interesting is I pulled up a few definitions of virtue signaling, and kind of, I guess the thing that's coming up for me is like the anthropological approach, right? Because as Justin said, like signaling that you are a trustworthy trading partner versus, the definitions that I'm looking at talks a lot about, doing something in order to garner praise or acknowledgement. Is one way of looking at it, versus another, which is kind of just blog content. So take this for what it is virtue signaling is often used as a form of persuasion. Well, often maybe in today's day by virtue of volume, but as Justin called out, is that like prior to the existence of the internet and social media, that certainly wasn't the case. So, and kind of touching on what Laurent said, it seems that it's a matter of intent, right? So if you donate to something and then you say I donated to it, if you want other people to donate to it, you're virtue signaling to bring other people in to do this action that is for the good of these people. But if you do it to showcase that you did it and to get other people doing it so that you can be kind of like the influencer of such, then that's a very different thing. And that's entirely intent.
Yeah, and if I can just highlight it, at least indirectly, I think, has to do with in-groups. So in other words, you send a particular virtue signal in order to say you're part of this group, even if the group is simply ideological. And that goes back to what Justin was saying about the evolutionary background. It's at least similar in some ways, or might overlap with what's called costly signaling. So to use a religious example, from an evolutionary point of view, it wouldn't seem to make sense to use a lot of resources that could be used to reproduce or to generate food, to use a lot of resources with costumes or with lots of dancing or spending time creating shrines for ancestors, that sort of thing. But doing that it's a costly signal to your group that you really believe in the norms and the values, that you're committed to the group. The more people believe and the more they signal, the more of a certain kind of cohesion in the group. But then, of course, the downside is that the other side of the in-group cohesion is out-group antagonism. So it's also a costly signal to be willing to go to war, to be willing to not share with out-group members, or to discriminate against them, or even kill them.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting along those lines when you think of kind of what we were joking before we started the live stream, that today is Ash Wednesday, so there's going to be a lot of Catholics that have like ash, like dark crosses on their forehead, and basically that symbols that they are Catholic, right? So it's a social signal. When you walk around and you see someone with that, you'll know that they're Catholic. But that's not a very costly signal.
I'm not Catholic, society. Nor would I have known that I would be like, oh, you have some schmutz.
Yeah, you have some schmutz, exactly.
But see, using the word schmutz can be a signal.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was intentional for comedic purposes.
That's right. Not only do I use that, my son now uses the word schmutz. So that's the thing about cheap signals, is anyone can mimic them. So Brian, if you walked outside with like an ashen cross on your head, people would probably be like, he's obviously Catholic, right? Because it's a cheap signal. But in some cases, these signals are super costly. And in one example, for example, there's a ritual called the Kavadi, which is actually so painful and bloody that it's outlawed in most countries. It's really only allowed in 3 countries now. It's allowed in Mauritius, it's allowed in, I think, the Philippines, and it's allowed in Malaysia. I might be wrong about the Philippines, though. And what people do is they take large, basically like spears, and they stick them through their face, and then they will hang things on them, and they'll walk for like 5 to 10 kilometers with buckets of milk on either side of them, right? As a way of trying to show their devotion to different Hindu gods. They'll also take limes with hooks in them, and they'll hang them on their body. And you'll have people with 200 to 300 hooks hanging off of their body as they walk through the heat of the day. Not Malaysia, by the way, Singapore. It's legal in Singapore. So when I was in Singapore, I was helping to do research on this. And one of the things that's interesting is there's a relationship between the age of a male and how and his social status and what he does to his body to show his devotion to the group. So men who are of like peak breeding age, if you will, that are looking for a mate and don't have very high social status are the ones who are going to be putting the most holes and the most pain through their body to show their devotion. And I have a picture of this one guy. He was about 16 or 17 years old. So like, peak raging hormones. And he did about 5 or 6 kilometers in Singapore in the dead of summer in this humid and heat of the city with a pole a little smaller in diameter than an American quarter that went completely through his face, and he had hung lines all over his body. And the first thing that he did was when they took the pole out, the other men were helping him take the pole out because only men do the really hard piercings in the ritual for the most part. Women will carry heavy burdens and things and like different icons. And as soon as he did that, when he was with the other men, they were like, "Oh, are you okay?" and all that stuff, like, "How you feeling here? Have some water," and that sort of thing. And he was like, "Yeah, I'm doing okay. Like, everything's fine, blah, blah, blah." But the moment these 2 girls walked over to him, he was like, "Oh, it was really hard." Like, the woman kind of played it up. And I remember thinking, like, wait a second, dude. What is... And it was interesting because it directly aligns with a lot of what you see in signaling theory. Another version, though, is this isn't just done by humans, right? Bowerbirds are these birds that make these elaborate nests where they actually take different colored trash and flowers from around their dwellings, and they build these huge huts with all this different color. Peacocks are also kind of like the standard bearer of this in evolutionary theory. Peacocks have these beautiful plumes and this beautiful like long feather, but it makes you easier to kill. But it signals your fitness, because if you're still alive and you have this giant dragging like 12-foot tail, it means that you're obviously not to be messed with. And
so how much of virtue signaling is just like getting close to death and not dying?
Well, to an extent, very little of it, because most of it is just like #warriors these days. But you can start to see, as this comes offline and goes into the real life, that a lot of virtue signaling, people are expecting you to back this up, and doing things like protests and dangerous behaviors of protests do become aspects of this.
To bring this to a very silly place and also a very kind of like self-centered place, but because Tony arrived, and I know Tony shares a similar tendency as myself. When I was dating and riding a motorcycle full time, it sent a signal I might not be around for a long period of time. And all of the women that I was actually interested in over the years were the least interested in me solely because of the motorcycle. And then the women who were interested in me because of the motorcycle would come like talk to me in some form. And then immediately just realize that I am not like the prototypical bad boy, and that I'm just a fucking nerd. And so they'd like walk up and see like motorcycle leather gear and whatever, like, "Oh, so I just automated something with this thing," or like, I don't know, whatever. And they'd just be like, "You're not what you signaled yourself to be." It's I that wasn't intentional, because I like when I got a motorcycle, I just wanted a motorcycle, and go into a long story about that. But it is interesting how you can garner something but then also not feel called to back it, and then kind of on the other side of it, kind of back to what you were saying, is like the thing that comes to mind is Budweiser spending like $5 million to have a Super Bowl commercial to tell people that they had donated $500,000 to charity.
Exactly.
That's a great example of purchasing.
Marketing has this all the time. I mean, what was it? Like, one of the greatest virtue signal flops in marketing history was Pepsi during, some of the peak issues around. It wasn't. I believe it was Trayvon Martin, and in some of the protests that happened after some of the issues with Trayvon Martin, Pepsi hired, I believe it was Kylie Jenner, where there was these large protests. It was obviously supposed to be like a Black Lives Matter protest, but Kylie Jenner, the white savior she is, came out of the crowd with a Pepsi and gave it to the police officer, and peace was seen by all. And it was so on the nose and so like the hell are you thinking, Pepsi? But it was just such an obvious virtue signal for which you're like, Pepsi, you're not involved in this.
Yeah.
And so it was very vacuous. It was immediately seen to be just a hollow virtue signal, and it didn't go anywhere.
Or the razor
Oh,
commercials.
it went somewhere. It
Oh,
went,
yeah, exactly.
it went
It
all the
went-
places.
That's true. Yeah, but in the worst ways.
Can I give a silly story that illustrates it quickly? Because it almost always comes to mating in some way, as Justin hinted. When I was, I don't know how many decades ago, I was in my office and another professor was talking to him on the phone, and blah, 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 blah. And then a secretary walked up. Her name was Joni, a young, cute, nice secretary. And then she walked away, and the professor said, "Oh, did Joni just walk up to your desk?" And I'm like, "How did you know?" And he said, "Your voice dropped an octave for about 10 seconds." So without me realizing it, I was sending a virtue signal that I.
Hello, Joni. How are you? Yes. Mm-hmm. Great to see you.
Yeah, you do see a lot of that. I mean, everyone does it differently, and everyone does it differently when they're trying to be attractive to someone, right? Because that is the very idea of being attractive to someone, is that you're sending them signals that you hope will be well received, right?
So how do you, because we're all blind to our own biases, how do you measure your own virtue signaling?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah, in a way, it really comes down to, do you practice what you preach?
I happened to run into someone in a cafe who is one of the junior people responsible for the Pepsi commercial that we just mentioned. And I will decline to share what he shared in terms of the people who were involved in the types of conversation that led to the production of that commercial. But
I just hope there was someone at the table who went, "No, don't."
there were several people, and similar to the Fire Festival documentary where everybody who disagreed got fired, that. So how do you, like, when you're in that conversation, what's the metric that you bring to someone who's, lost in their own story and unable to see it from the outside? Like, how do you reflect that back to them?
I think that, it differs in all kinds of cases. How well you know the person, how much ideological difference there is, how important it is in the context that they learn to challenge what they're doing. But it definitely requires some level of learning self-critique, learning self-awareness, and that's a long journey for all of us.
Yeah, it's for me, the measurement of it can also be like hyper quantifiable, because all of us have our own self-identities, our own personal identities, and it's the information that we use to build up who we are and how we see ourselves in the world. And then, of course, we also have our social identities, which are how we feel about the social groups we belong to. But then there are these intersocial sort of things, which is, it's not the information that defines ourselves, and it's not the information that defines the other groups that we align ourselves with, but it's the information that defines the other, and the other people we talk to, the other groups we might interact with that we don't think are like, that we're not part of or we don't feel part of. And a lot of times that's where the virtue signaling gap happens, is because someone signals something and it doesn't align with the information that we hold about the group, right? So when you think of Pepsi, you're more likely to think of Britney Spears than you are thinking of social justice. And so when they put out this commercial, everyone was kind of like, this does not align with anything that we know about Pepsi as a company. So we're going to call bullshit on it. And this is the sort of thing that also happens with people, right? If you know that there's this guy and he goes around, drinking every weekend, trying to just have a bunch of one-night stands, and then all of a sudden he puts this hashtag feminism thing on social media, a lot of people are going to be like, wait a second, like, on the face of it, there may be nuance where this makes sense, but on the face of it, your bullshit detector starts to go off. And that's one of those things where the incongruency between the information that we have about someone, our sort of our prior information, and the information we're receiving about it, if there's too much of a distance between those two things, the virtue signal is likely to fail. If it's close enough, then it's likely to just be received as like pumping up the crowd, right? It's just like, I did this, and it's like, of course that person did. That's very on brand for them. Rah rah, and they keep going on. But ideally, those aren't just signals so much as with the virtue signal ceases to be a signal in a negative sense is when you see that they're backing that up with a behavior, with an actual, like a tangible action.
So what's the action? I mean, like we talked about this a little bit before, is like virtue signaling versus virtue actualization. Is that the phrase to use?
Yeah, I think that's that fits for this purpose for sure.
Makes me want to make a virtue actualization report card.
Yeah, and I think, and you see this in a lot of places, right? Because a lot of the people who are virtue signaling are trying to be leaders in some way or another, either in a small group or maybe in a larger sense. They want to be influencers. You see this very much in the typical influencer space on social media. But you also see this in politicians all the time. Like, one of the most, in my opinion, embarrassing aspects of social signaling we've seen in years was during the George Floyd protests when Nancy Pelosi and several other people who drafted the 94 crime bill decided that they were going to dress up and take a knee in the Capitol. And it's like, all of you people have had years to do something and you've done nothing. And instead of addressing the very real and very tangible list of grievances that protesters have put on your desk, you're going to just take a knee, and really what you're doing is taking a photo op, and then you're going to move on with your life. And nobody asked you for a photo op. They asked you to take these tangible steps, and they didn't do it. And so that was seen very much as a virtue signal, right? Because their actions didn't back up what they were signaling they were doing. And then you have someone who, in my mind, has gotten very high ratings, the president of the Ukraine, right? Zelensky basically was like, no, we're standing here and fighting. And instead of going and sort of hiding or going to another country, like a lot of international leaders are apt or prone to do, or going into some sort of bunker here and there and never being seen from until after the dust settles, he's been front and center. He's been out in the open, and the way that he's treated this conflict has been like something no one's ever seen before. Like, it came out recently that in a call with the United States, the U.S. asked him to evacuate Kiev, and he was just like, no. And basically, what he told the U.S. government was, "I don't need a ride. I need ammunition." Yeah. And this is the sort of thing where his actions of staying there and going out onto the streets of Kiev while it's being shelled with his prime ministers and his ministers of defense and intelligence, and doing these reports via selfie to show that they're still in the city and that they're not playing around, is just, it puts the action behind what they're saying, and it's creating a paradigm of leadership unlike anything anyone has seen in the modern world and in modern politics. And a lot of people don't know, right? But Zelensky was not a politician by career, right? He was like the Jon Stewart of Eastern Europe. He was a comedian who saw a lot of issues, had a lot of grievances, and was like, look, I'm going to take this to the ballot box and I'm going to run. And he did, and he succeeded. And it takes it to a whole nother level.
So, and this is a very broad question, but you said in modern history, right? So rewinding back, like back in the day, there were commanders. I mean, you look at, I don't know, Braveheart, right? I don't know what period that was in specifically, but where the commander of a battalion was at the front. And then at a certain point in history, it seems that changed, and then the commanders were then sitting in the back. What changed?
A lot of it was sort of a change to, and it wasn't necessarily that a lot of it changed, right? Throughout the feudal period, you see warring states, right, where different lords and kings would rarely put themselves at the front. They would often put themselves in armor and put themselves in the back on top of the hill where they would kind of direct everyone. And it was really only the true legends that would lead the charge, so to speak, right? And that's why we have these sayings today in English, right? Oh, they're leading the charge. Has to do with the leadership proposition of a guy going into battle in front of the people he's asking to die for him. And then on the other hand, you have he's just leading from behind. And that means he's behind the lines on top of the hill calling shots without putting any of his own risk in there. But different leaders have done it differently. I mean, when you look at, throughout American history, you have these legendary figures that have done this, like George Washington, in his crossing of the Delaware, which is kind of like an immortalized in American mythology. But you also have Eisenhower, right, who was one of the key commanders and was very much leading D-Day. You have Ulysses S. Grant, right, who was a Union general during the Civil War, who became president. And these people very much became legend, who became sort of like the warrior, poet, politician style people. And those individuals are often well memorialized. A lot of the kings of Europe, they all fought in battles, but very few of them ever actually had to draw their own sword. And those who did and lived to tell the tale became legends, but a lot of them are just forgotten and thrown by the wayside because the moment they had to draw their sword, they realized that any peasant from the warring army could easily slaughter them.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them, they never had to see open combat. They had other people fight their battles for them. And that sort of hard leadership is not easily found, particularly not from a comedian. And in today's world, most politicians are career politicians. They're not even everyman kind of approaches. They're, they started as the justice of the peace in their local district and worked their way up through state senators and state congressmen to federal level, and then the federal level into executive level. And they're just career government people. And people don't respect that. They don't trust them. They're the taxpayers. Or the tax collectors, rather, right? They get to spend all of our money, but they don't seem to be putting a lot on the line for what they're doing for us, and it creates a huge disconnect.
Right. Yeah. You brought up the Pepsi, or like when you think, and granted, I think this is our generation, so I don't know how much it extends out or cross borders, but you said when people think Pepsi, they think of Britney Spears, and I do, I certainly do, but. Britney Spears was what, like 1999 Pepsi? Like that was, at least a decade ago.
Britney's back, bitch.
Yeah. How do you, I mean, but I guess the thing that I'm kind of poking at is it's becoming harder and harder to measure virtue signaling, right? Because you look at, you talk about Pelosi taking a knee. It's like, well, for most people, you had to actually get involved in that particular branch of politics. Like most, people in the United States were invested elsewhere, or if they were invested in that particular story, they had like a light degree of understanding. So you see this happen and you're like, well, that seems kind of off. Why does that seem kind of off? And then you have to do all this background research or reading or trust someone else's perspective, which may have its own bias infused in it. And it's like this whole process of validating virtue signaling when you think it, and even when you don't think it, you're influenced by it unconsciously. And we're kind of seeing that now with all the propaganda that's flying around the war in Ukraine. So how do you? I mean, it'd be really interesting. I don't think there's an answer to this question, so I won't frame it as a how-to. But it'd be interesting to have a technological tool that helped to distill these things. I mean, one of the initial titles we talked about for this talk was, simulation, right? So simulating someone's belief system and then saying, here's their belief system based on everything that they have said and done in the past. And then here's this left fucking field Kylie Jenner handing a Pepsi to a BLM police officer, or riot police or whatever. That's, by a factor of 200, like out there.
Yeah. And I mean, to an extent, right, we do have that technology, and that technology does exist, because one of the keys to measuring this is that it's always in context, right? Because it's this signal. I'll let her know that she's upstairs. Again.
Bless her again.
I will. Ash Wednesday. So she's thrown me off. That's what she's done. So virtue signaling is always done in context, right? Because your signal has to be. All signals involve a sender and a receiver, and this goes back to like old school communication and informatics theory. But when you take it into like a more cultural realm, so for the nerds, moving from Claude Shannon to Dan Sperber, you start to realize that all signals are received by cultural groups and in a cultural context, and we all exist always in these contexts, whether we know them or not. And so when someone says something in a certain context, you have to understand like what that context is to understand the extent to which there is a similarity or a difference between the information they're saying and what's expected to be received. And so you can kind of see an example of this, because another good example, and I'll stop picking on Nancy Pelosi for 2 minutes, is Donald Trump, who is just easy pickings for this, right? The guy ran as a Republican, and it's kind of like, who are you kidding? Like, for example, when he was in, I think it was a primary debate, he was asked, oh, you're a Christian, and Christian values are very highly correlated and associated with the Republican Party. He was asked what his favorite Bible verse was, and he was like, I really like all of them. And it was like, come on, dude, you can't even throw out a John 3:16 or like some standard, like just make something up, man. Most people don't know. And so he couldn't even do that. And I think it was one of those things that was an obvious failed virtue signal, because you can look at the expectations was that he was going to say something, and he said nothing. And so this is one of the more complicated things, but it still has to do with the violation of the expectation of the group. So the first thing you have to do, right, measuring the signal, measuring what someone says is easy enough to understand that information. But you also have to understand the expectation of the receiver. And the expectation of the receiver is directly related to the context that they're in. And you can think of this almost like different languages, right? If you know someone who speaks 2 languages, and you speak both of those languages as well, but you always speak the same language with them. If they speak language B to you, they speak the other language to you, you might be confused just because it's so out of context, because socially you've agreed that you always speak English. But then all of a sudden this person's speaking to you in Spanish, you're going to be like, wait, hold on. Let me readjust this for a second. I wasn't expecting these signals to come in the context of the Spanish language. And so you see that not just cross-linguistics, right? But basically, if you see that even across different cultural boundaries as well. And so if you can measure the expectations and beliefs of a social group, which is exactly what we do with our tech, that's the way that you can set the foundation for understanding what's expected, and understanding like, look, that's a value signal that they're expecting to see, but that's not how they understand you, because you have to triangulate what they think about you, what they think sort of about each other as a social group, and then what you're sending. And if all 3 of those things align, then it's a conversation. If there's a break in any of those like 3 points, and you can't complete that full cycle, then something's not going to land well.
If I can just give an example, Brian, one of our simulations we're working on now, emotional contagion, trying to understand the mechanisms that drive the spread of misinformation or fear during the pandemic. So in this model, which we're just about ready to validate now, in this model, you have lots of different agents that are meant to represent Norwegians, which based on surveys and the social media analysis that Justin did. Each agent has a different ideological bent, right? So they're more or less liberal or conservative. Each agent has more or less susceptibility to anxiety, and each agent prefers to, for example, be vaccinated or not be vaccinated. And then at each time step in the model, they look for someone to signal to, and they try to if they're anxious and certain other conditions fit, and they scan their network for people who are more or less like them, and then they try to send a signal, literally, to send information to them to convince them to either not get vaccinated or get vaccinated. And then the success of that signaling has to do with a whole set of algorithms based on psychological and sociological assumptions about networks, but also about the actual answers that a representative sample of Norwegians gave. in a certain longitudinal survey. We did a survey relatively toward the beginning of the pandemic, and another one as things were sort of at the height of the pandemic. So to answer your earlier question, Brian, yes, we can we can simulate virtue signaling.
So, part of what I heard was that when they feel anxious, they try and virtue signal to see if, like, what is it? Is it to see if they're a part of the in-group?
Or well, say for example that I am worried that if I don't get the vaccine, or if other people around me don't get the vaccine, then I'm particularly susceptible to it for genetic reasons, or because I'm just afraid of dying, that if I get COVID-19, or somebody that I love might die because it's so contagious. So then I'm going to try to signal to people to convince them that they should get the vaccine, so that the people around me will be, so that'll actually change my in-group. So one of the conditions to decide whether and how emotionally you signal is how many people around you hold a similar view.
Yeah. And one of the things that you can then do with that, though, is calculate the likelihood, though, that someone might even change their beliefs in light of new information as well. Because if you're reinforced and everything around you is reinforcing what you already believe, it's very hard for new information to break into that. And that's one of the interesting dynamics, I think, about misinformation. Because a lot of misinformation is kind of trying to tap into this value signaling approach where they say, oh, this, and this is what people are expecting. Well, let's tell them kind of what they're expecting, even though it's not true, to manipulate them into being on our side. And you see that in all kinds of information warfare. But misinformation today is one of the worst sort of culprits of that.
Interesting.
I'd like to share a personal story about this. And Brian, this kind of points onto your question you had earlier about some type of like virtue actualization report card. You know, so like in my business, I see my main competitor being Fair Trade International, which is a huge virtue signal. Like, it doesn't mean shit if you see fair trade. It's actually a corporate marketing tool, but it makes people feel warm and fuzzy inside when they see that on the label of food, and they think that they're being a conscious consumer when they buy that. And so my take on it, and this was a decade ago, was like, forget the signal and just let the data speak for itself. And so that's why I believe in transparency. That's why I believe in infinite amounts of data and letting people have the power to access that data. And that essentially being that report card, Brian. But what I've come to realize over the years, and this could be just circular reasoning happening over and over and over again, at the end of the day, you know, if you do surround yourself with people, so like my social media, for instance, I made it very personal, even though it's a brand for products, I made it very personal, and I put a lot of information out there. But what's happened over the years is that, like, without a doubt, I constantly just get validated no matter what I say, right? Because of the context. Like, everybody just wants to believe that whatever I put out there is truth. And at the end of the day, the only person that can hold us accountable for our own virtue actualization is ourselves. And like the report card in and of itself.
So what you're saying is we're doomed.
We're doomed. But therapy helps. And that's where therapy is great, even if you're healthy.
Yeah, but we can't. Can we get a therapist for like corporations? Can we like? I would love for this to happen. We're like instead of like a B Corp, like we're a certified TCorp, where our entire executive team is in therapy on a weekly basis. Like.
Yeah, because a therapist, their job is meant to be like a third party that's not invested in you, who's not going to just constantly validate you, but will help you hold yourself accountable for knowing, you know, if what you're saying is true or not. So, yeah, it's a vicious cycle, and we're kind of doomed. So all we can do, I guess, is just like keep working on ourselves and just focus on ourselves versus trying to get that validation from the outside. I don't know.
Okay, TCorp.net seems to be available.
That's a virtue signal in itself as well. Like having that seal.
No, I take that back. TCorp.net is already registered. What the hell is TCorp.net? I mean, it is a virtue signal, but at the same time, like with a B Corp,
Which is also, B Corps are virtue signals too, big time.
So B Corp, B Corp, Fair Trade, I think of all the other ones. B Corps,
S corps in Vermont, for example, where you can register like social good corporations, where they're for-profit companies, but your profit is not always measured by pure monetary gains.
Right. And so there's like the B Corp, I don't know if you can call it a movement. They call themselves a movement, right? I've never heard of the B Corp being called a movement except for on their website. And you have to qualify, which takes time and money. And I think time, it takes like 3 years, and money, it takes like, I think like 10 grand or something. And then you have to uphold to their kind of rules, and you have to abide by them, which is very subjective, because A, they made them, and B, it's like done by a council and not the general public. So anyway, as far as a T Corp, it's like, do we have to, does an executive who is mandated by virtue of their certification as a T Corp, go into therapy? Do they actually have to do the work in therapy? No, they could just sit there for an hour and fuck around on their phone, and that would be, considered therapy, and then they would get all of the, the consumer value of being a certified T Corp. But, me being me, I think sarcastically, it would just be really fun to call ourselves a T Corp. Our entire executive team of one person is in therapy. You're welcome.
It would be super meta, though, if Elise had a T Corp.
Yes. I think T-Lit should be the second certified T Corp.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I would totally do that. I recently started. Oh, I
wonder how much trouble we'd get in if we just took the B out of the circle and put in a T and called it a day for a logo. I don't think the T Corp company would be able to be a B Corp at that point.
Probably not.
No.
But it doesn't matter.
We're at the point where presidents and just general politicians are being elected based on memes. And we're at this point in society where everything is so memed and so parodied that it's almost, I kind of feel like something like a T Corp, which is very much satire, but at the same point not, there's actually a phrase that I really liked, which is metamodernism, which is, hold on, let me pull this up. The definition of metamodernism is the mercurial condition between and beyond irony and sincerity, naivety and knowingness, relativism and truth, optimism and doubt, in pursuit of a plurality of disparate and elusive horizons, or said simply, a kind of sincerity communicated through an insincere distancing.
Nice.
Oh, so it's entirely political discourse on social media today.
Basically, yeah. Right, so if you create someone on Reddit said, are T Corps people by tax definition? I don't know how to answer that question because we just made up T Corps about 10 minutes ago, so TBD. But I think a T Corp as
can they donate to political campaigns? Because if so, they're definitely people too.
Well, but that's the interesting thing. So a B Corp, right? So if you go to, where is it? bcorporation.net. If you are a certified B Corp, that has absolutely nothing to do with the United States. It has everything to do with bcorporation.net's constructed report card of what you have to do in order to apply, and then continually report that you are upholding. It has zero to do with the United States government or any government. It's fair trade, for example. Fair trade is a air quotes independent organization that comes up with these criteria to be fair trade, and then they have their council that determines if you've met those criteria. And so for an actual B Corp, where it takes you 3 years to become one, you're actually a C Corp or an S Corp, or I think even an LLC, right? That's your legal kind of certification in the United States. And then you apply to get the B Corp certification. So responding to the person on Reddit, a B Corp just because it says corp, it's actually like a branded term. It's not actually a, you know, corp in the sense of a different type of corporation.
Not a legal
it's
structure.
just a yeah, it's not a legal structure. It's just a certification by just that name. So like, you know, T Corp, Q Corp, you know, X Corp, Tony Corp, like, doesn't matter. You know, sorry, Tony, I was just certified Tony Corp. What's a Tony Corp? A Tony Corp is a corporation that's certified by Tony. Well, how does Tony certify? He says
LLT,
yes.
limited liability Tony.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of highlights the ridiculousness of virtue signaling, but at the same time, it also highlights the power of virtue signaling, because fair trade.
Yeah, what was that documentary you brought up a few weeks ago, by the way? Was it like Seaspiracy, where the whole thing about like fair trade seafood is just bullshit. Like, it's all virtue signaling, but in reality, it's just like a stamp that you get to make people feel better at the grocery store, at the checkout aisle. But the actual reality of the situation is that it's oftentimes just, it's nonsense. It's just, you know, who paid who for what, and, you know, there's a loophole in it this way, and these loopholes are deliberate because most of the time, you know, there's this major moneyed interest that's interested in kind of supporting that virtue signal so that they can fall in line with what's going on. I think you see the same thing a lot with like the way that this also reflects in policy from an institutional standpoint is, you know, you want to try and make it so that, you know, GMO foods could potentially be called organic and stuff, right? So that Monsanto can get in on the organic train. And a lot of it is just really, it all comes down to virtue signaling. There's nothing behind it except, if I can put that on my box, I'll sell more boxes.
Yeah.
And so there's just not a lot behind it, right? It becomes very vacuous. And the cheaper the virtue signal, the easier it is to say what that is, and in order to tell people that and to get around it. Like, and this happens not just in corporations, but, you know, religions as kind of like the original pre-capitalist corporation, they often see this as well. Like, you know, in the Vatican, for example, if you go into St. Peter's Cathedral, you can only get so far unless you're there to pray. But if you know, even as a non-Catholic, all you have to do is say, I'm going in to pray, and the guards will let you in. And like, they don't track you, they'll let you in. But that becomes the sort of thing where, like, how do you get across that velvet rope, if you will, in the Vatican? In some religions, it's very easy to fake how you become part of it. In other religions, it's very difficult, right? In a lot of religions, you know, you have to have literal like scars on your body to show that you've been initiated into the group. Whereas in large religions like Catholicism, there's no such thing. You know, all of the things that you would do can also wash out.
In Protestantism, it's even easier.
But
you just have to believe. It's
and even barely sometimes. You just kind of show up.
Atheism is hard because you have to not believe, and if you believe that you don't believe, then you're believing.
Nice.
That's true.
Is anyone truly atheist?
And some of them, though, you know, you have really difficult ones, like, you know, Judaism has a number. You know, circumcision is a very hard to fake signal later in life.
I don't know about you, but I don't always flash my dick when I show up for temple.
I don't either. Then again, I don't go to temple very often. Yeah, right? I don't show up for temple very often. But before we have our kosher meal, everyone, you know, you got to check. No, but that's one of those things, right? And this is a very interesting one because it comes back to one of the reasons why people do the social signaling, right? Is that there's an evolutionary basis behind mating that has to do with this. Because if anyone's going to know if your husband has the sign of the covenant, it's the wife.
I think so. Now that you're bringing it to mating, you remember that, I forget what nationality they were, but that was that couple that the husband and wife got married, and then they had 4 children, and then the husband sued the wife because she hadn't disclosed to him that she had had plastic surgery, and he found out when all of his children were ugly. So he sued her, right? So there's a public lawsuit that his children are going to find, and there's like this photo that went viral of the family, and it's like, how did you think that was going to go well for you? And you can Google this and see the photo, but it's terrible because, sure, like, what damages are you going to recover, right? Like, you're going to recover some money, and yet, your kids are going to be completely lambasted forever. You all are Googling that right now, aren't you?
$120,000.
Like, isn't that so? Virtue signaling can be good unless it's insubstantive. The insubstantiveness of crappy virtue signaling is driven by people's short-term goal setting. I think people are naturally myopic, and I think the fact that the incentive structures around crappy virtue signaling feed into that myopia is a problem as much for the incentive structures as it is for the individual people. You can't send everybody to therapy. You can only hope to give them better structures to work in, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, right. I mean, you can't really separate the pieces themselves, right? Like, they are interdependent, because once you try and look at them independently, they don't make sense. So you have to consider the signal, the incentive, and the individual doing the signaling, I think, all at once in order to really explain what's going on in any one case. And yeah, not all virtue signals would necessarily be bad, right? And we can think of a lot of them that we do every day, like considering someone else as trustworthy is something that we would signal every day. Like, not cutting in front of the line of someone is almost, it's like these small behavioral scripts that are also signals that say, look, I'm an okay person. If someone starts like going around and doing something sketchy in a store, for example, they're like wearing this big coat and they're looking around a lot, they get very nervous. Those are sort of like anti-virtue signals. It's like you suspect this guy of being nervous because he might be trying to steal from the store. And so that's one of those things where people are going to interpret that, and they could interpret it as sort of like the opposite of a virtue signal. One of the other things, though, that you see, I think, more plainly, is that people can get away with a lot of things in public if they're dressed a certain way. So if you see someone who's dressed like they just came out of a business meeting, they're more likely to be able to get away with certain things with either a slap on the wrist or nothing at all, or just being able to say, I'm sorry if they get caught, because they sort of signaled a certain social status and a certain amount of sort of trustworthiness by the way that they're dressing to try and get through that. And that's a very easy to fake signal. Anyone with a nice enough suit can get through places. And a funny example of this, there's actually a YouTube channel. I've seen them do on multiple YouTube channels, but there's a couple of places where guys will just wear like yellow vests and pick up a toolbox and just walk into a concert and just act like they're supposed to be there because they're helping something.
Yeah, someone did that recently with a ladder.
Yeah. You see, why would anyone, in the context of a concert, why would anyone have a safety vest and a ladder if they're not there to fix something? And so you just walk right in like you own the place.
Yeah.
And
I used to do that in Vermont with a really big camera lens, but then camera lenses became cheaper and other people could do it. So I would like to offer some clarification. According to Snopes, the father suing his wife for not disclosing plastic surgery is apparently fake. So apparently they posed for a photo and then the children were digitally altered by a plastic surgery clinic to sell plastic surgery with the tagline of the only thing you'll have to worry about is how to explain it to the kids. So that was a fake story, verified, but still fucked up, just in a different direction we initially thought. Different virtue signal for non-action. For sure.
So what's the ultimate virtue troll? Like, what is, like, if that was like the opposite of virtue signaling, what would that be? I mean, for me, my personal goal would be to troll someone like Elon Musk, who like is claiming to save the world, but then, accumulating so much of the wealth and power, simply by creating something that is conventionally successful, but when it comes into the headlines or into people's attention, they can look back at the track record and see, wow, that was actually done with a lot of dignity and virtue versus questionable behaviors. I don't know. What is the virtue troll?
trolling by definition is eliciting an emotional reaction, whether positive or negative, just emotional. So virtue trolling, I think the T Corporation, where in order to be a certified T Corp, every executive has to be in therapy for a certain amount of time.
But to be a
right?
certified therapist, the therapist has to be anti-capitalist and pro-abolitionist as well. So that's going to be complicated, but extremely interesting.
Right. So like we can make up those credentials however we like, because that's the whole point of this, certification process. Anyone can create one, and as long as someone else is like, I would like to have that certification, and if everyone here is like, Justin, would Culture Pulse like to be a certified T Corp? If you get some people on board, and then some people are gonna ask the question like, wait, for real? And the answer is, not yes, not no, just not nothing. So I think that's the troll, right? Is to parody all of these virtue signals, and make people like, start asking like, wait, is this serious or is this parody? And then just constantly toe that line, which is in itself metamodernism, which is this kind of sincerity communicated through an insincere distancing.
In a way, a lot of the satire places like the Onion and Babylon Bee are really good at that.
Good examples. I need to run, Brian.
Before you do, I'm using Topia's new group chat to post a link to my memo on metamodernism. And if you would like to learn about metamodernism, I would highly recommend watching the video in that memo, which is all about the philosophy of Shia LaBeouf.
Got it.
I'm either gonna love or hate that. Or maybe both.
I think both. I think definitely both.
Probably both.
Thank you so much for joining. We'll see you next week. Justin, Laurent,
thank you guys.
You've been fantastic and interesting and compelling. Elise, thanks for showing up. And then also let's collaborate on the background on our new TCorp certification. We can vary in the terms and conditions that you have to drink tea at least 2 times a week.
Oh,
and James and Tony, it was fantastic to have you. We look forward to having you again, hopefully next time. And until then, everybody else, thanks for joining us at Practicing Safe Sex, where we talk about peaceful intergroup relations and sometimes go on 40-minute tangents about corn syrup. That's it.